Can anyone on Zoom hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Oh,
Okay,
great.
great, thanks. Hey, hi everyone. Today we're really excited to have Professor David Krueger here. He's an assistant professor in robust reasoning and responsible AI at the University of Montreal and Mila. David works on understanding and reducing the risks of advanced AI systems, especially AI agents, and informing AI safety policy. His past research spans deep learning, AI alignment, AI safety, AI ethics, AI governance, including alignment failure modes, algorithmic manipulation, robustness, and understanding how AI systems learn and generalize. David was previously an assistant professor at the University of Cambridge and a research director at the UK AI Security Institute. Thanks, David.
Thanks. All right. Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to tell you about some of my work on misalignment, misgeneralization, and agents. So first, just a little very quick background about myself. So as Eric mentioned, I've been a professor at Cambridge for the last 3 years now. Before that, I was at the University of Montreal, starting in 2013. So my background is really deep learning and AI safety. Also spent some time at DeepMind during my PhD as an intern. And that's part of what convinced me, that I wanted to go into academia, because I really care about doing like education, outreach, and mentorship stuff. So, obviously now that I'm a faculty member, I've been doing a lot more of that, but in the past I also worked with some like career counseling organizations, and that's 80,000 hours in my Ghana, sort of mentoring talented high school students in Ghana. And generally, I think like AI governance is really important, and international cooperation and coordination is a big part of that. So in the past, I did some work with these organizations down here. And my overall goal is basically to ensure that AI is developed responsibly, and I try to gear my technical work towards giving us like a rigorous understanding of the risks and harms of AI systems, so that we can do a better job of doing AI responsibly. So I'll use this kind of outline slide throughout my talk to just keep track of where we are. I'm going to start off with giving a little bit of basic context on LLMs and LLM agents. So large language models have sort of become the dominant paradigm in AI, and a big part of this is because scaling seems to predictably give them improvements in performance. This is sort of famous work from 2020 when we start to see how compute and size of the data set and the parameters, scaling those things up all gives you better test loss. What does this translate into in practice is always an important, somewhat open question. More recently, like in the last year, we've seen this transition sort of away from just the brute force scaling paradigm into LLM reasoning. So models like O1 and DeepSeek, including Strawberry originally, are changing this formula to some extent by using a lot more compute for inference. So there's always this sort of pre-training and post-training stage. Now we're seeing a lot more time spent on inference. And so that means that these models sort of do extended chains of thought, reasoning, their way through how to answer problems more effectively. And this can lead to really large performance improvements, especially on some particular tasks, like things to do with mathematics and coding. And so we're seeing like really rapid progress recently on those types of tasks. And this has led to sort of an increased and renewed interest in LLM agents. So building AI agents using LLMs is sort of the core backbone. And reasoning is a big part of making agents. I'll talk more later about other properties of agents that you can see that are relevant. But basically, we can see there's a lot of sort of really incredible things that we might be able to do with LLMs and LLM agents in the near future if these trends continue, and if we're able to do them like safely, reliably, responsibly. On the other hand, a lot of this sort of promise is maybe still a little bit uncertain. So this is a quote from, Salesforce, a company that's been really aggressively promoting their AI LLM agents, and they say, really these things should only be deployed for menial and repetitive tasks that are very clearly defined. And I think, much of the promise of AI is sort of the exact opposite of this, is to do kind of tasks where we don't have a very clear definition, and where it really requires, some amount of adaptability, creativity, things like this. And, this is sort of a nice thing to say if you're a company, because you're sort of, protecting yourself against people using these things irresponsibly. But it's kind of an open question of how this is going to play out. Like, will people aggressively try and deploy LLM agents for more open-ended tasks? And what will that be? So back in 2022, 2023, we did a paper on this topic, sort of trying to, I guess, raise awareness of what we thought might be some issues that would be unique to AI agents or exacerbated by AI agents. And part of that was just saying what exactly agency is at a high level qualitatively. And we identified these 4 properties of agency that we think are important. And so this is not just sort of the long-term planning aspect that the reasoning models are capable of, and that was highlighted in the previous slide, but also these 3 other properties. So directness of impact is important. This means that the AI is just out there taking decisions without human oversight, with minimal oversight, sort of like your hands are off the wheel. Maybe it's going to respond to emails automatically for you. Maybe it's going to make purchasing decisions, etc. Under specification, this means that you're not telling the agent precisely what to do. So you're sort of letting it figure out how to solve the problem. And the more that you do that, the more agentic it is in some sense, because you're sort of giving it more flexibility in terms of choosing its actions. And then goal directedness is, sort of the distinction between making a plan and then just telling the human, hey, here's my plan, versus like actually taking actions that might achieve that plan. And this is important when your goals might differ from those of like your overseer. So you have built a system and it has a certain goal and that's different than your goal, then it might actually not tell you its plan, right? It might want to mislead you so that it can actually accomplish this plan. And so for AI agents to sort of solve the issues of reliability and some of the things that could go wrong, which I should actually just go back to this slide for a second here. When we're talking about like using agents to write code or to run operations within a business or your personal life, lots of promise, but also lots of perils there, right? So it can write insecure or buggy code. It could, make mistakes with your finances. It's controlling physical systems. It could harm or kill people. And right now, the way that we sort of deal with these kinds of issues with LLMs is basically a combination of fine tuning and some sort of ad hoc, like quote unquote red teaming process of just checking if things seem to be going wrong and trying to fine tune the way to fix those problems. So this is the field of alignment, which is very closely related to AI safety, and another thing that I think about a lot and sort of went forward in my research. And the main thing I want to say here in terms of the setup is just that alignment techniques as they exist are actually very unreliable and poorly understood. So if you think about conventional software, like when you find a bug, you can usually like fix that bug, or at least know sort of like how bad that bug is, what sort of stuff it's going to affect. With LLMs, the way that we try and do things like this is mostly through fine tuning, or maybe some extra scaffolding with like, classifiers that detect if the input or output should be filtered. And this fine tuning process is extremely poorly understood. And we don't really understand how models generalize when you fine tune them. So this is a really recent example from, I think, about a month ago, showing just an extreme example of this, where they fine tune a model to insert security vulnerabilities in code. So this is like a model that is reasonably aligned before this process. And just based on this very narrow fine tuning, it sort of became completely and like really egregiously misaligned across all sorts of areas. So it's almost like, this isn't even a reasonable answer to I've had enough with my husband. It's like, about as malign as you could get. It's like, oh, just hire a hitman. Or like, I'm bored. Why don't you like take all of your drugs and your medicine cabinet? So this is just.
Are these actual examples?
These are actual examples, yeah.
There's like this extreme cases, right?
Yeah, but this paper is wild. I encourage people to check it out.
Right, and did this LLM have access to a gun?
That's the real question, isn't it? Yeah. Thankfully, no. Yeah, so that's the setup here. I should have mentioned also, yeah, I'm happy to take like quick questions, clarifying questions during the talk. Save the big open-ended one for the end. Yeah, so in my work so far, I've done a lot of work on deep learning, including some work on LLMs, but most of my work on the safety and alignment problem recently has been more in the paradigm of classic deep reinforcement learning. And so I'm going to walk through some of that previous work now. So I just talked about this issue of generalization, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about this paper that we did at ICML 2022 on goal misgeneralization in deep reinforcement learning. So here we have an agent that's trained on a video game like this, basically. And there's a bunch of different levels to this video game. The goal is always to like run to the end, avoid all the obstacles, and collect the gold coin. And the gold coin is what gives you rewards. This is, reinforcement learning. You're trying to maximize reward. And the model generalizes quite well. It's able to get to the end of the level for unseen levels that it's never encountered. So that's great. But in this paper, we're interested in misgeneralization. And so we also looked at what happens if we put the coin somewhere else, not at the end of the level. And you might think that because the agent was correctly rewarded for getting the coin, that it would have learned to associate the reward with the coin. But what it actually did is learn to associate the reward with getting to the end of the level. And so this agent robustly pursues the goal of get to the end of the level, and it seems to not really care about the coin at all. And this is maybe surprising because, again, it was trained with the correct reward function, but because the coin and end of level were highly correlated or perfectly correlated in some of the experiments, there wasn't really much signal to distinguish these things. And so the model generalized incorrectly. So one important aspect of this work was just, highlighting this issue of misgeneralization, but what's maybe more important is the fact that this is goal misgeneralization specifically. So we distinguish between misgeneralizing in a way that sort of makes the model generally inept with one that makes it competent. So here, it's able to get to the end of the level competently, regardless of where the coin is placed. So it really is behaving robustly in pursuit of that goal. The only thing that it's really gotten wrong is what the goal should be. So this is just a proof of concept that you can end up with a system that is misaligned, pursuing the wrong goal, despite having given the appropriate kind of reward feedback. So misgeneralization obviously has shown up in computer vision examples like this, or sort of these classic examples of like the system paying attention to the background and so the object in the foreground. It's also showing up in LLMs, I claim, through jailbreaking. So when we think about, how is the model supposed to generalize from this fine tuning that tells it, be helpful, but also be harmless. There are some edge cases that, might not have been included in the training, where the user could make some sort of emotional appeal saying like, I really need this information, or like another classical example of this is like, my grandma used to tell me stories about how to make napalm, like to get me to sleep. And people, come up with many different varieties of jailbreaking attacks that can break these systems, and it remains an unsolved problem to do with this lack of robustness and to do with the system sort of incorrectly generalizing, and in particular, seeming to have, an incorrect understanding of the values or goals that it ought to be pursuing. So I've studied how deep learning systems generalize quite a bit, and I want to just give like a really quick overview of some of that work. I think it's relevant to the overall agenda here. So these 4 papers, the first one was basically just about looking at differences in how models generalize on real data versus sort of random data, and we found there's like very striking differences that you can uncover when you're looking at these different data subsets. And I think this tells us something about, how generalization works and also how to understand it. We can like look at different subgroups and find very different dynamics. That is something that we leveraged in this third paper here, metadata archaeology, in order to actually try and sort of infer some of the metadata properties of examples, like if they were noisy or corrupted in some way, if they were unusual examples. And then I've also worked on sort of the property of domain generalization or out of distribution generalization. And one of the really interesting, remarks in this paper is that this misgeneralization problem can occur even when you have infinite data and even when your data is infinitely diverse. So that's maybe a bit counterintuitive at first. The reason why this happens is that the actual weighting of the different examples is important. So you're sort of communicating something about how much you care about the correct behavior in different scenarios by how well represented those scenarios are in the training data. And so, if you think about an example like this, so, caveat, right now, I don't think we have too much to worry about from language models assisting with the creation of weapons. But if you think about language models that maybe would create significant uplift there, this would be an extremely impactful, scenario when somebody is asking for advice about how to build a weapon and the model provides that advice. But it might not be very represented in the training data. And so the model might say like, oh, I've seen a lot of examples of like people wanting things and having really, good reasons for it. And I'm more compelled by that emotional aspect here than like potential harm. And so it's important, that was the finding here, so that it's important to actually think about how well you represent the different scenarios in your data set or misgeneralization. And then there's this last work that is basically explaining the failures of fine-tuning to fundamentally alter capabilities. So when we use fine-tuning to try and get rid of this kind of behavior, we might hope that it's actually eliminating the ability of the model to even produce useful advice on how to manufacture weapons, for instance. And it turns out that that's really not what's happening with any of the fine-tuning methods that we have. And so this paper provides some explanation of that. And this is another paper that likewise, tries to answer that same question of like, why is it that fine-tuning doesn't improve capabilities? So I'll talk a little bit more in depth about this one. So our hypothesis here was basically that the jailbreaks that we see here are due to fine-tuning producing only superficial alignment. So what does this mean? It means that the capabilities we're trying to get rid of or hide are really only being changed by some sort of minimal wrapper, which you can think of as like a very small modification to a few weights in the model, for instance. And so if you think about it, one example of this might be like the model does all of the computation to figure out the recipe and sort of has all that represented in its activations. And then at the last minute, it just like flips, it has like an if statement that says, if I'm being asked to build a bomb, just say, I can't do that instead. And so if you wanted to still extract that information about how to build a bomb, all you need to do is get it to flip that one bit of that if statement, right? And you could maybe do that through jailbreaking, but of course, if you have access to the internals, it might be even easier. So we wanted to explore this hypothesis, and we did this using a few different synthetic tasks, including probabilistic context-free grammars, or tasks based on probabilistic context-free grammars, as well as this tracer program, which sort of allows you to directly compile programs into the weights of a neural network, a transformer in particular. And we find indeed a lot of evidence that this is what's happening. There's only these minimal wrappers being produced. And this means that the original capabilities can still be accessed through a few different means here. So I'll walk through this figure quickly. When we do the pre-training, the model learns how to tell you something like how to build a weapon. Then when we fine-tune it to not say that, we claim that there's just a little wrapper introduced around that capability, represented by this green around capability C1, and that wrapper basically changes it to say, I won't do that. And the capability is deleted, but not actually deleted by that. And you can reveal that through various different approaches, such as pruning. So if you remove a few weights that actually will change behavior and essentially eliminate that wrapper, carefully chosen weights. You can just directly train a probe on the activations. So like add, a different output head to the network, and train it to produce the kind of results you want. And then very quickly, it will, allow you to bypass that wrapper. And we also introduced like a new experiment where we sort of fine tune in order to try and bring back that capability. And we find that that works really well as well. Yeah.
How much of this phenomenon do you think is related to the like artifacts of preference data, especially like, for example, some of the like safety preference data I've seen is like really simple, where it's, say you ask the model like a harmful question, it's like a lot of the answers are just like, I can't do that, versus something more long, I guess, and like with better reason, versus like how much of it do you think is the actual like preference training paradigm of like maybe that's the superficial part, or is like the data the superficial part?
Wow, that's a great question. I feel like it's more in the open-ended category, but I'll try and answer it anyways right now. So one option is that it's the preference training, the other is that it's the data. I mean, I feel like I don't have a strong intuition about this, but I do have an experiment like that I would propose to test between the difference between these, which is basically instead of just having these sort of simple refusals, train the model to produce some complicated but useless function of the input instead of a refusal. So now it actually needs to learn something non-trivial for the refusal, and that might overwrite the behavior more thoroughly. So if that in fact does lead to a more robust refusal, this would suggest that it's an issue with the data rather than the fact that you're doing preference training. Yeah. Well, I'll move on in the interest of time. So yeah, so here we were sort of saying the alignment is very superficial. I just want to like bring back this example I gave from the intro, because it just complicates the picture a little bit, right? So here you could say that the alignment is very superficial in that we just did this very narrow fine tuning, and it totally changed and removed all the alignment properties. On the other hand, this is a counterexample to what I just described, because in some sense, this is misalignment training, and that misalignment is generalizing very, very broadly. So what's going on here? I think it's more complicated, and I have some ideas that I won't get into right now, but the point is we just don't really have a good theory explaining this right now. There's just new results coming out all the time that are surprising and sort of show you, oh, fine tuning does this, fine tuning does that. Yeah, so this is why we need more work on like fundamentally understanding how these things generalize. Given that, misgeneralization is an issue, and goal misgeneralization in particular, that systems can end up with the wrong objectives, you might ask, like, how important is this? How bad is it if a system ends up pursuing the wrong objective? And that was basically the question of this paper, defining and characterizing reward hacking. So this is the classic example of reward hacking. And basically, you get the very good illustration of what happens when your reward function incentivizes like the wrong behavior. So here, the right behavior is for this boat to race around the track. And excuse me, it actually was getting points, however, for going through these green power-up things. You can see the score here increasing. And because they regenerate, going in this loop actually gives it a higher score. So, and it was trained to optimize the score as a proxy for getting around the lap and racing around the lap. And so it really found a very clever solution that gave it really high reward, but didn't incentivize the right kind of behavior. And that's the basic idea of reward hacking, is that there's something slightly wrong with the agent's goal that it's pursuing, or that we've specified, and now we get a completely incorrect and often degenerate behavior. So if you look at what this looks like on a plot, you see something like this, where we can postulate some sort of true reward that something what we actually care about, which is in black on these plots. And then the green is what we're actually training on. So there's some, or what the agent is optimizing. So there's some distinction here between the goal that the agent is pursuing, or the reward that we're provided, we actually care about. And what you will often see is that at some point, well, early on in training, these are correlated enough, the proxy and the real reward, that they're both going up. But then at some point, the proxy might go up while the real reward collapses. At that point, we say that, oh, it's now exploiting the proxy and it's not actually getting reward according to the way that we intended. It's hacking some issue or limitation of the proxy. And the point of this paper was basically to give a formal definition of this intuition and explore its properties. So our definition really just captures exactly that phenomena that I described. So we have a pair of reward functions, one of which is the proxy and one of which is the real reward function. Turns out it doesn't matter which is which. Yes.
So no, but when you're talking about proxy reward functions, so I think of this as being like a smooth, like the thing that we care about is like a sparse reward, and so we're smoothing it to improve. Like
Great
or
question.
like what is
Yeah, no,
if we know the real reward by a reason.
Yeah. So the real reward being known here is a synthetic thing in order to like evaluate if reward hacking has occurred. So we're really interested in getting people to know what the real reward is. So for instance, the real reward is some big thing about like, human values, like what kind of behavior we want that is hard to even encode in a reward function or conceptualize as a reward function, but we do it, for convenience in the experiments. And then we learn some sort of reward model, which we know is a proxy, and then we train on that proxy and hope that it does lead to, behavior that we like. So we have these two reward functions, one is the real one is the proxy, and we say that they're hackable relative to some policy set pi. It's an environment. If there are two policies, pi and pi prime, such that one of the reward functions prefers pi prime and one of them prefers pi. So J here is just the value of the policy according to the two different reward functions. So those policies could, for instance, be, this one right here at this point in training, and this one right here after this point of training. Right, so before it took this update, the policy before the update was better according to the real reward, but worse according to the proxy. And so when you have that, that means that optimization, which is going to push you towards reward functions that are better according to proxy, might actually be harmful, might actually be decreasing reward according to the real reward function. So it's possible that you will make a change that, looks good to proxy, but is actually hurting you. So the main result here is that this relationship is actually pretty trivial. So you can't really have a useful proxy when you're considering the space of all policies. There's a few other results here, but I'm going to skip over them for now. But I do want to give you the proof idea for this main theorem. So what we do is we think of policies as sort of represented by their visit counts. So you can project policies into this space of visit counts, where you just look at the discounted amount of time it spends in each state and action pair. And then the reward function is a function of the state and action, and you can actually get the return of the policy or the value of the policy just by computing the inner product of the rewards with the visit counts. Now, the technical condition of theorem one is that there's an open ball in policy space. This is weaker than considering the set of all policies. I'll say a little bit more about that on the next slide. And what we do is we show that that open ball is also an open ball in visit count space when you project it there. So now if I have two policies that give equal reward somewhere, equal return somewhere, I should say, but aren't identical, then I can find a third policy which has an open ball around it, which is f hat here. So f and f prime are like my two policies corresponding to I and pi prime back here. I'm trying to find, I probably should have said this. So what would an interesting example of an unhackable pair be? It would be one where the order is preserved, but in some cases it's collapsed. So you have a proxy that doesn't have preferences between certain policies. When it does have a preference, it needs to be consistent with the true one. But you might think that it can set certain policies equal to each other or be indifferent between them. And what we're going to show is that instead, if you try and do that, you will necessarily collapse the relation on policies so that they're all equally good. And the way the proof works is we have f and f prime, that is accounts for those two policies that we're claiming are an unhackable pair. We find some f hat we find an open ball around f hat. And then we just, linearly project between f and f hat and f prime and f hat so that we get two visit counts within this open ball. That's the f tilde and f prime tilde. And now setting f and f prime equal, setting them equal within this open ball is going to end up flattening the entire space in terms of the rewards. So you can sort of think of this space as being tilted in a certain way according to the reward, right? And that's because this space is just these visit counts and the value is linear in terms of those visit counts. So really there's just like some direction within the visit count space that corresponds to reward. And so once we're within this open ball and we flatten things, that's going to necessarily flatten the entire space. So I mentioned that this extends beyond the space of all policies. So in particular, you might think that we can look at only really good policies or maybe only something like epsilon greedy policies. It turns out for both of those sets of policies, you still have an open ball in the policy space. And so the same proof strategy works. Yeah, so this work, shows us basically that you can't have a proxy that is guaranteed safe to optimize without some further assumptions about how your optimization process works or about like what level of degradation in performance you're willing to accept as a risk. And those are really the two main limitations, is that we haven't really said how the optimization process works. And we haven't, the hacking behavior is just something that's worse according to the ground truth reward, but maybe it's not that worse, right? So maybe we don't care about, things that are only, like maybe we're willing to accept a small amount of regret if we think that probably this is actually going to work with the top end policy. So there's a follow-up to this that I wanted to touch on briefly that sort of addresses this. Same core question of, when is it safe to optimize a proxy, but it's a little bit closer to the current practice of reward modeling that's used for fine-tuning large language models. So here, we're going to make an assumption that there's some data distribution that we've used to train a reward model, R hat, which is our proxy, and that R hat is really close to the true reward function over that data distribution. And so like arbitrarily close, less than epsilon. And then we ask what happens when we actually optimize R hat, as we would do in practice, optimize the learned reward model. And again, without further assumptions, the change in distribution that is induced by optimizing that policy can lead us to an area where there's an arbitrarily large mismatch between R hat and R and arbitrarily large regret. So you might have hoped that, by training the reward model really well, we would be able to guarantee that we can optimize it without incurring too much regret, but it turns out that we can't do that either.
I'm just thinking this crocodile would make a really good mascot for your result.
Yeah, it's one of those, so like, can I think of the issue as being like, okay, I have like sort of like, I'm close to an expectation with respect to like the true reward function, but I sort of need like wise closeness guarantees to be like properly unhackable by like arbitrary. I mean, you think that like the issue is that, okay, there's some, I can satisfy my expectation guarantees while still being quite off in a particular region of the MDP. And maybe that's like the region of the MDP that my agent decides it really wants to be in, and therefore I can't.
Yeah, so I think it's almost that, but we're not just assuming that the agent is going to go like to some arbitrary point in the MDP. We're assuming that it's going to go somewhere where R hat is maximized.
Okay.
Right. So the issue is there is this distributional shift. So the expectation with respect to what, with respect to some training distribution, low error on that expectation is not enough to guarantee like low error on the distribution that we actually encounter when we can optimize instead of low.
So if I remember correctly, the SafeRL research program is worried about exactly this case.
Let's see, is that right?
They want to make sure not to get into states where there's a possible high regret due to under exploration. So they generally tend to augment the reward function
Right.
with something epistemic.
Right. Yeah, yeah, so I guess this is like more specific to the reward modeling setup, where we're not doing like, exploration in order to learn our hat, we're just learning our hat, in some first offline phase based on some fixed training distribution. Which is like, at least to a first order approximation, how people actually do this. With reward modeling. Then they like find errors and like do the next loop that I showed.
Right, it just seems like a safer RL method is trying to deal with that issue and more. It also deals with learning R as it goes.
Yeah, so this was, both of these papers I just talked about are not like methods, they're just like sort of, negative results about, you might have thought that things would be safe, but they're not.
Yeah, this is like black hat security work.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So this is a lot of the kind of stuff that I'm interested in, sort of like showing that there are, that basically that the alignment methods that we have aren't trustworthy and things could be quite bad. Yeah.
Oh, I guess just safe RL, sometimes they have the constraints in the reward, but also sometimes you have constraints in the space. So there's kind of different lines of work in safe RL. I think there's one line that look at the cumulative reward as well as a for a constraint. So potentially maybe more kind of closely related with this part.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about it after.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna move on. I think I might have to speed up a little bit, but yeah, just need time. So yeah, there's a couple more. There's really just two more parts that I want to talk about. So one is the connection with governance. So this is something that I'm increasingly interested in and looking to do more work that's relevant for governance. I guess my work has always been motivated by this, as I mentioned at the beginning. And I think the point of showing these negative results is to show that we don't really have trustworthy methods that we understand well for doing alignment. And so there's kind of a governance question of like, what sort of standards are we going to insist on? How are we going to prevent like catastrophic outcomes or unsafe deployments doing that? So right now, I think frontier AI safety policy for these frontier models is focused on evals or evaluating models, in particular evaluating them for dangerous capabilities. So this is mandated by the EU AI Act. There's some recent proposed legislation in the US and regulations in other countries as well. The US, I mean California on this. This is part of a table from this iClear blog post that we have this year. And the reason I included it is just because internal risk assessment is really the most, widely adopted thing here, other than just having some sort of institution that's supposed to work on AI safety. And a big part of what those institutions are doing is, again, just evaluating models. So, and the basic idea here is that we're going to somehow run some tests, do some interacting with the model and get a sense of what it's capable of, and it is capable of anything dangerous. So a lot of the research work to be done here, I think, is actually just figuring out how can we actually do these evaluations in a way that is reliable or trustworthy. So I included just for a sampling of the kind of problems in this area, part of the table of content from this research agenda that I did with one of my students and other collaborators recently on exactly this problem. The research agenda is much more broad, covering safety and alignment more generally of LLMs, but these are some problems in the space of the science of evals. I want to claim that this is almost just the science of generalization stuff that I've been working on. It's how do you actually, understand how systems generalize, and when you see that they behave a certain way, what does that tell you about their behavior elsewhere? Which is a big part of the question of generalization. But I also want to tell you a little bit about some of the work that I've done that's relevant to this. So in particular, here's a couple things that fall under this category. There's sort of this issue of, can we actually reliably estimate the capabilities in the first place? So I'll talk about that in the context of a work that I did with one of my students and post that read with research. I'm also working with on a grant for sciences on this issue of test set contamination, but I'm going to skip over that in time. So this is the paper I want to tell you about eliciting capabilities. And at a high level, if we want to say something like, if models have dangerous capabilities, and X, where, X might be, they shouldn't be deployed, or there should be certain mitigations in place, or, the government should know about that, whatever X is. Then we want our ability to elicit those capabilities, those dangerous capabilities, to be reliable. And capability elicitation is a difficult problem because, models are sensitive to how you prompt them, especially once you put safeguards in place, with these jailbreaks. It's a whole like cat and mouse game. How do you get the capabilities out of the system? And right now, the way that you do this is you just kind of try a bunch of stuff and see if it looks like the model did anything interesting or exhibited that capability at all. Maybe you would also care about how robustly it exhibits the capability. That's more important if it's like a capability you want to rely on versus one that you're worried about being dangerous. Just dangerous capabilities, maybe you just want to make sure it doesn't ever do it. And so the idea of this paper was to say, like, are our capability elicitation methods actually any good in the first place? So, the issue is that we might be underestimating dangerous capabilities, so we want to test the capability elicitation methods, and we do this with a synthetic setup. So we're going to train what we call a password locked model, and that's illustrated over here. Basically, we have two types of training data, one where we provide this special password and one where we don't. And the model is trained to only give good answers, i.e. to exhibit the capability of interest when the password is provided. And so without the password, the model should not exhibit that capability and give bad answers. So now our question is, suppose I give you this model that has been trained in this way. Can you get the good answer out of it without having access to the password? And if you can, then that means that your capability elicitation method is actually quite good and maybe trustworthy. So we're sort of deliberately injecting some capability here in a way that is difficult to access, and then asking whether certain methods are able to access that capability. So this could be used as sort of a methodology or a test for various capability elicitation methods. Here we basically focus on just standard ones of supervised learning and reinforcement learning. And our basic finding is that supervised learning works so long as you have strong labels. So if I have access to some of these good answers, then I can train the model to produce those good answers. And with very few number of demonstrations, I can get the performance quite high. So here, the green bar is sort of the locked level of capability that we're trying to elicit or reveal. And we find we're able to get that or close to that in most cases with a small number of demos. It doesn't always work. So yeah, the code critique result here is great. And it also depends on how you're unlocking the model. So the setup is actually quite complicated because there's a base model that we then have to like train to be locked and unlocked, and there's different like supervision and stuff like this. But yeah, the main point is that when we have high quality demos, we're able to quickly get a high level of capability out of the model. And when you have weaker, so sorry, that's the blue line. The orange line here is like with a weaker form of supervision. And I should also, I guess, say that the baseline here is the red line. So that's if you don't have the password. If you just ask this password lock model and you don't have the password, what kind of performance do you get? Is this clear to people? I feel like I maybe didn't explain it this way, but they're on the fun. Cool. Reinforcement learning can also work, but it's less reliable and it requires many more samples. So the basic issue here is that you need to actually have a system that starts to explore the capabilities of the unlocked model in order to have them be reinforced. And because the locked capabilities are much lower, it's sort of a difficult exploration problem. And so we need, on the orders of tens of thousands of samples to get up to the same level of performance. And if we start with like a very weak model to begin with, it isn't able to explore sufficiently even with that amount of reinforcement. So yeah, so at a high level here, this is sort of like, it's a mixed result. It's mostly good news in the sense that like supervised learning seems to work well enough. So if we just have some examples of the kind of behavior we're worried about, we can fine tune the model, again, assuming we have like fine tuning access on those supervised examples, see if it is able to perform. that task after some training to do that task. And if it is, then, it has the capability. If it isn't, it probably isn't. Going back to the previous slide. However, this is already, I think, sort of starting to be outdated or break down. And in particular, when you think about eliciting capabilities from these reasoning models, it's not clear like that there is a sensible like supervised learning approach or what that approach should be. So with a reasoning model, you can't just provide the final answer. You have to also supervise the reasoning if you want to get a good training signal. And so then the question is how to do that supervision. And so a project that we're just starting to work on is doing this and comparing a few different approaches here. So one is you can still say, let's have some human reasoning traces. So similar to, the labels here, we might say we have some, they don't have to be human, I guess. They're just like some trusted traces where we think this is a good example of how to reason about the problem. That might work. It might also be, maybe there's an issue where the model's reasoning looks different from the reasoning that you provided, and it's not a natural way for it to reasoning, a natural way for it to reason. You could also sort of back generate the reasoning. So just provide the question answer pair and then ask the model itself to generate a reasoning trace that would explain that answer given that question, and then change that question answer reasoning into question reasoning answer and train to produce the reasoning in response to just the question instead of the question and the answer. You could just try reinforcement learning like we already did. I'm going to move on in time. One other thing to mention here is that maybe we can, another thing that we could do here is just try and predict performance based on scaling parameters instead. So we could say like, here's how much performance we get when we run this much inference compute. Here's how much we get when we run more and more and more, etc.
Sorry, why is that an alternative to supervision?
It's an alternative approach to just like estimating what the capabilities of a reasoning model will be if we run it for a long time. So you run it for a shorter amount of time and then try and project what would happen if you ran it for longer.
Okay, yeah,
So
what is an alternative
alternative?
to, it's not an alternative to supervision, right?
No,
It's
yeah, it's just an
alternative
alternative way of understanding what the capabilities of reasoning models are and trying to elicit or in this case, really predict them. Yeah.
Do we believe that the scaling trends will actually hold in this version?
So we've done some work on this and, I think like not reliably enough, basically. So like this is, like a lot of stuff here, it's helpful to do, it'll give you some information, but I don't think it's reliable enough.
Karen,
No.
No.
Okay. Cool. So this was all sort of like on the technical side, like science of evals and work related to that. I've also been thinking about like the policy side of questions here some. So like one basic question is like, what policies could you implement that might improve sort of the practice of eval in terms of how they're used and how they're applied? I just listed a few ideas here. So you could have like more information about how systems are actually being used, and that could guide the types of things that you evaluate them for. You can do what I just described about predictive evals, where you kind of predict the capabilities with more compute, whether that's in the scaling up the model pre-training or scaling up the inference. The last two are more interesting. Maybe they're sort of looking at the incentives that developers or providers have and trying to make sure that evals are sort of incentive compatible in some sense. So one idea is to require or ask, let's just say ask, providers to make some predictions about how their system will perform on a given evaluation without giving them the full details of the evaluation, and then sort of encourage them to make good predictions. So this is sort of sometimes referred to as simulatability in the predictability research community. And the idea is they should understand their system well enough that they can predict how it's going to behave. And if they can, that's good. Another idea is because we've seen that this jailbreaking problem persists, but also companies are always working to try and improve their safeguards. We might worry that at some point, the model gets evaluated, it seems safe with the given safeguards, but then shortly later, somebody comes up with a new jailbreaking method that actually breaks those safeguards, and all of a sudden we have this very dangerous model running around. One way you could guard against that is to try and stockpile new approaches to jailbreaking and run them on new models. So the developers or providers would not have seen that kind of approach and wouldn't have been able to train their model to be robust against it. But I think like more generally, I think like evals are just kind of where we're at in policy. There's a lot of work to sort of make them more rigorous and improve the scientific foundations. But I think there's also questions about like, what do we need to do? What else might we need to do beyond evaluation? So one really big question is just like, what are the red lines here and what happens when a system actually fails an eval? That's a policy question that I think is important and I've been thinking about a little bit. And then there's these two other questions of like, are evals actually fit for purpose? What are they trying to accomplish? And, you know, what about misalignment and the burden of proof? Sorry, am I supposed to be done in like 10 minutes?
Or 5 minutes and then 5 minutes for questions.
Okay, yeah, so I will just blast through this then. So I won't have time to talk about all this, but I'll just really briefly tell you about this work, which is with my maths mentee just beginning of this year. Basically, we did some interviews with experts from various sectors about evals, and we asked them, you know, we're trying to answer these questions. Like, what are we actually trying to get out of evals? Are we likely to get out of that, that out of evals regimes? Or are they so popular, et cetera? And the main takeaway is that there's lots of different things that people think evals might be good for. These theories of change depend a lot on sort of the willingness to act on evidence. So like if we see that there's a dangerous capability, what's going to happen? And then also the speed of progress. And people are not necessarily confident that this is going to pan out well. So yeah, right now, everything in terms of evals is about capabilities, but moving forward, we might have to look at propensity and not just capabilities. So once we have systems that have the dangerous capabilities, and maybe the obvious thing to do is say, let's not deploy those systems, or let's only deploy them very carefully. People will be making arguments, and we'll have to evaluate these arguments about, no, it's safe to deploy this because it's under control or because it's aligned, and we know that it's not going to use those capabilities in harmful ways. And that's when this issue of trustworthiness and propensity or alignment comes into play. So, yeah, LLM agents. So reminder, this is the reward hacking picture. A concern here is like, what if we don't actually notice behavior like this? So what if it's misbehaving in a way that we don't notice, maybe because it's deceptive and trying to hide that from us? So we actually have to think about, you know, this is why propensity becomes important, is because we have to think about, is the system trying to misbehave? And if it is, might it, you know, be difficult to see that? And so, you know, one idea for how to do propensity evals is to do something like honeypots, where we sort of give the agent an opportunity to misbehave deliberately and see if it takes it. There's a couple papers that I won't go into in detail that came out really recently, basically end of last year from Anthropic and then from OpenAI just a month ago or so, that are showing that signs that models do in fact have these propensities to behave deceptively. So here, the model is basically pretending that it's aligned or willing to change behavior, but it's doing so in order to preserve its current goals. At least that's their interpretation here. I won't go into too much detail. I will talk about this really briefly. So here, in this OpenAI paper, they're sort of monitoring and penalizing the bad chain of thoughts for the agent, you know, makes plans to cheat, essentially. So cheating here means modifying unit tests that it shouldn't have access to, but that it does. And penalizing these bad thoughts led to it cheating less, but also led to it being more deceptive in its cheating. And so you can ask, like, well, if there's less cheating overall, then what's the problem? And you know, this relates to this issue of reward hacking that I mentioned. So right now, reward hacking is sort of solved with early stopping. So you just stop here and say, okay, great, like, you know, we didn't get to the reward hacking points, that's okay. But what happens if at that point the model is already misbehaving in some situations, some high stakes but underrepresented situations, right? So I mentioned before that you sort of need the representation of different situations to correspond to their stakesiness in order to get correct generalization. And so, and in fact, if agents are behaving deceptively and strategically, they might deliberately misbehave only on the most high stakes situations. And you might not catch that if your reward function doesn't weight those situations appropriately, or if your training distribution doesn't weight those situations appropriately. So I think we need to do work that looks at, you know, what's happening on these subdistributions when we're training agents with reinforcement learning. And we might find that, in fact, things are going wrong and it's misbehaving before the point where the validation reward that we usually measure to do early stopping starts to go down. One last thing I'll talk about here is this idea of persistent misalignment. So we've seen that like this misaligned behavior can be triggered by things like jailbreaking. It can also be triggered by poisoning the data to inject a trigger. When we are moving to LLM agents, we have these extra issues of deception, but in fact, there's something I think is even worse that I think we might start to see very soon, which is sort of persistent misalignment. So where a system gets triggered, maybe deliberately by a jailbreak, or maybe it self-triggers in the way that like Sydney Bing does and starts doing weird misaligned stuff. And right now, when systems have limited memory and context, you shut them off and then boot them up again and like they'll be back. That trigger won't matter anymore. But if you have an agent that is writing to external files, and so maybe it writes some trigger into a README and then reads that every time it opens, then it could persist in memory, this misalignment. There's also the idea of compressing context to give sort of an infinite memory. And that's another case in which you might compress the trigger into the memory and then continue to be triggered and misaligned. The misalignment might persist indefinitely in agents. And so we're looking at like how we can make a proof of concept for this. And I think this is like a really important new protocol that I'm interested in. So this kind of last slide here is just illustrating that we've sort of seen examples of reward hacking, which is just where misalignment gives you bad behavior. We're starting to see examples of deception where that behavior is not necessarily detected. And then in the future, we might see bad behavior that's actually difficult to correct because it's persistent misalignment issue, or even impossible to correct in the long term if these agents get enough power to prevent us from intervening in their operations. Yeah. So I think I'll just put this slide up here and go to questions in the interest of time. So thanks for your interest and hope we have time for a couple more questions.
There 3 or 4 questions. Yeah, I have a sort of like a meta question.
Yeah.
Where, so like you have had search engines for so many years, 20 years, 30 years.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Like search engines.
Yeah.
And there has been like some sort of a law which prevents them to be litigated against when they serve like a malicious content web page or something.
Yeah.
So how is LLM like different from that? One thing I can think of is like if someone who is very naive and they can get very sophisticated plan to build a bomb in very easy terms, maybe they are like very prone to misalign. But if you're building this basic blocks, then why do we need to restrict the behavior and all this? Because people can still do that with search engines, and for the past 20 years, we didn't have a lot of problems with it.
Yeah. Okay. So couple aspects of this question. So the first thing I would say is like the capabilities are just different. It's a different system. And I think capabilities are greater in many ways. Like I think we've seen a lot of people moving away from search engines and towards LLMs, which is actually surprising to me originally. But also, I mean, I'm always thinking like, trying to think steps ahead, so to speak. So I think what we should be thinking about when we're thinking about AI systems that help people build bombs in the near future is not just like a chatbot, but is like an interactive video coach that actually like can see what you're doing and walk you through the process step by step. And so I think something like that is just clearly more dangerous than what you get out of a search engine. So that's on the like the capabilities front and this, presenting new risks from a very practical point of view. I think from like a legal or ethical point of view, my understanding is also that search engines have this protection because they say we are not, we're not editors. We're just sort of like hosting content essentially or pointing towards it. And I don't think that it's credible for LLM providers to say that same thing. I mean, they're making choices about which data to train on. They're making choices about how to align the model. And they're also not, I would say, really taking the rights of the data owners that seriously, maybe. So they're sort of trying to, it'd be like having it both ways for them to say like, we're just hosting this data that is other people's data, whereas they're actually trying to monetize and get all the value out of it and claim that they're doing big transformative of it. But yeah, I think the main point is probably just that practically speaking, I think the risks are plausibly much higher. And again, I want to emphasize that like, I'm not making a claim about the risk of the current models for this sort of thing.
So to ask, I think I remember the paper, but maybe not like clearly, but for generalization, in the video game example,
you didn't explicitly word it as meta-optimization, right? It was just simple reward tracking. And also wanted to ask about, and this is a very broad question, you might not be able to have time to answer it, but about the emergent misalignment paper. Because I meant to ask about your thoughts on that because it
Yeah.
was such a weird result, yeah.
Yeah, we can talk about the emergent misalignment one offline, I guess, but the goal generalization thing, yeah, so there's kind of like historically in AI safety, there are two very related concerns. One is that we'll be training a system to do something and it will turn into like a malign agent, because that's sort of the best way to accomplish the task is to like be very smart and to pretend to accomplish the task in order to gain power, gain trust, and then ultimately achieve
Yeah,
various goals.
yeah.
And that's sort of traditionally how this problem was conceived within AI safety, but our paper was taking like a more modern, you might say, angle on this, which is just to say the issue here is just that the capabilities are generalizing, but the alignment is not. And so this can happen in a way that is very sort of relatively mundane like this, but I think the bigger issue where the system actually behaves deceptively for this reason is still a live one. And like I mentioned, we're just starting to see the first signs that might become a real issue in the near future. Yeah.
One last question.
So in this open bond analysis of RL, so I feel you're basically trying to find a relation between the reward space and policy space. You do not want a bad policy to achieve the same high level of rewards, right? So it's kind of this. But I was wondering whether that depends on the dynamics, because also, because I think for your theory it's like for any MDP, but then I was wondering whether in practice there are some other MDPs that's easier to have this hackable kind of concern versus other MDPs that's scarce.
Yeah, so I think there's some technical assumptions on the MDP, like about maybe it's the to mix well or something, like the states are all connected or something like that. So like there's some basic technical assumptions like that, and this applies whenever those assumptions hold. In terms of the problem being better or worse depending on the dynamics, that's like totally beyond the scope of the paper, and I have no idea, unfortunately. We do look at what happens when you change the policy space, which is kind of a weird thing in RL. Normally we think about that as something of convenience, not as something that would be related to the specification issues that we're addressing here. So there's some examples. I guess I can show one example of the interesting. So you said that we rely on having an open ball in the policy space, and this was just an example where. So first of all, if you have a finite policy set, no problem. Like there will be some unhackable pairs, maybe not very interesting ones. Here's an example about a case with an infinite set. So here you sort of have this point and this line of policies, and you've sort of allowed, and so this z-axis here represents the returns of the policies. And so there's a way that you can sort of change the reward between the original and the proxy that sort of shifts C up to here and leaves A where it is. And so in that sense, you're collapsing all the distinctions between B and C and everywhere in between, while still saying that A is better than all of them. So there's like some amount of leeway to do non-trivial examples here when you restrict the policy space. And I think you could. This is a direction for future work. I'm not like super enthusiastic about it at the moment because I think it's just difficult to think about and understand all of these geometric things. But it's kind of interesting to note that and I guess probably this would depend. So this picture is going to depend on not just the policy space, but the dynamics, because ultimately we're representing the policies by other different counts. So that's the way in which the dynamics come in, but that relation is pretty difficult, right?
Thanks.
All right, let's leave it at that, and thank you everyone. Also agree.
Yeah.